Dead Souls by Nikolai Gogol. Part 1. The Arrival of Chichikov. On a dusty road in the Russian countryside, a small carriage rolled toward a provincial town. Inside sat Pavel Ivanovich Chichikov, a polite and careful traveler with watchful eyes. He was neither rich nor poor-looking, neither handsome nor plain. He seemed like the kind of man people forgot quickly, yet he noticed everything. As the wheels rattled over stones, Chichikov smiled to himself. He had come for business, though no one in town could guess what kind. The town appeared slowly through the evening mist. Low houses, crooked fences, church domes, and muddy streets. It was not grand, but it was busy in its own sleepy way. Chichikov studied every corner as he arrived. He noticed the inns, the government buildings, and the market square. A person who looked ordinary, he had a habit of collecting useful details. At the inn, Chichikov stepped down carefully and brushed the dust from his coat. He spoke politely to the servants and asked simple questions. Who lived in town? Which landowners were nearby? Who held influence? The innkeeper answered gladly. Chichikov listened with such calm attention that no one suspected he was already planning his next moves. His room was plain but clean. Chichikov unpacked neatly, placing each item in its proper place. He was a man who liked order. As he settled in, he thought about the people he would soon meet. First impressions mattered. A pleasant word, a respectful bow, a small compliment. These were tools as useful to him as money. The next morning, Chichikov set out to introduce himself to the town's officials. He visited the governor first, praising the beauty of the town and the wisdom of its leaders. The governor, pleased by such graceful manners, welcomed him warmly. Chichikov's voice was smooth, and he always seemed to say exactly what others wanted to hear. From the governor, Chichikov went to the vice-governor, the prosecutor, the police chief, and others. Everywhere he was agreeable. He remembered names, noticed small vanities, and gave each person the exact respect they expected. Soon, the town began speaking of the charming new visitor who seemed both modest and important. At dinner parties and afternoon calls, Chichikov became a welcome guest. He knew how to tell stories without revealing much about himself. When asked about his past, he answered politely but vaguely. This only made people more curious. Mystery, when wrapped in good manners, can seem like dignity. The ladies of the town found him respectable. The men found him sensible. Even those who normally disliked strangers approved of him. Chichikov never rushed. He let trust grow slowly, like a vine climbing a wall. By the end of the week, he had become part of town life, as if he had always belonged. Yet, beneath his pleasant smile, Chichikov was always observing. He listened to gossip about estates, debts, quarrels, and family troubles. He learned which landowners were foolish, which were greedy, and which were lonely. Every scrap of information mattered. He was building a map, not of roads, but of weaknesses. One evening, he attended a grand party at the governor's house. Music drifted through bright halls, and laughter echoed beneath chandeliers. Chichikov moved through the rooms with perfect ease. He danced a little, spoke just enough, and watched everyone closely. This was not pleasure for him, it was preparation. At the party, Chichikov met several local landowners. One was Manilov, dreamy and sweet-spoken, with soft manners and empty plans. Another was Sobakovich, broad and solid, with the face of a bear. Chichikov greeted them warmly. He had already begun to guess which kind of men they were. He also heard of others: the widow Korobochka, cautious and suspicious; Nozdrov, reckless and loud; Plushkin, whose name was spoken with a mix of pity and disgust. Each estate was a different world. Each owner carried their own habits, fears, and desires. Chichikov listened as if these were harmless stories. Late that night, back in his room, Chichikov reviewed what he had learned. His fingers tapped softly on the table. A strange idea had brought him here, an idea so unusual that most people would laugh if they heard it. But Chichikov was serious. Sometimes the strangest plans work best because no one expects them. The next morning, he arranged for visits to nearby estates. He packed carefully and made sure his servant, Petrushka, was ready. Petrushka was quiet, sleepy-looking, and often smelled faintly of old books and dust. Though lazy in some ways, he understood his master's habits well enough. As they left town, the road stretched across fields and forests. Villages passed by like half-finished thoughts, a dog barking, laundry in the wind, children staring from gates. Chichikov sat in silence, watching the landscape. To others, it was empty countryside. To him, it was full of possibility. Their first destination was Manilov's estate. Even before arriving, Chichikov could sense the mood of the place. The road was pleasant, but strangely unfinished, like a promise never kept. A bridge stood where it was hardly needed, and pathways curved without purpose. Manilov himself came out to greet his guest with great warmth. He smiled constantly and spoke in soft, thoughtful phrases. Everything about him seemed pleasant at first, but Chichikov noticed that Manilov's kindness floated lightly on the surface, never settling into action. Inside, the house was neat but oddly unfinished. Fine furniture stood beside rooms left bare. A book lay open on the same page where it had rested for years. Manilov spoke of future projects, a garden bridge, a grand path, perhaps even a school. None had begun. At lunch, Manilov spoke sweetly about friendship, goodness, and the pleasures of country life. Chichikov smiled and agreed, but he was waiting for the right moment to begin the true purpose of his visit. Timing, he believed, was everything. As the afternoon light faded, Chichikov leaned forward and gently turned the conversation toward business. He lowered his voice, almost casually, and prepared to ask the question that would begin his strange journey. Would Manilov sell him his dead souls? Part 2. The Bargain Begins. Manilo blinked in surprise when Chichikov finally explained his request. He wanted to buy the names of peasants who had died since the last census, but were still counted as living on official records. For a moment, Manilo could only stare. The idea seemed absurd. Yet Chichikov spoke so calmly, so reasonably, that the strange proposal began to sound almost ordinary. Chichikov explained that the dead peasants, called souls in government records, were still a burden to their owners, who had to pay taxes for them. He offered to take that burden away. He spoke of paperwork, convenience, and friendship. He never rushed his words. He laid them out carefully, like stones across a river. Manilov was too polite to refuse, and too dreamy to question the deeper meaning. Soon, he began to find the idea charming in its own odd way. He praised Chichikov's cleverness and generosity. In truth, he barely understood the plan at all, but he was delighted by anything that felt unusual and important. To Chichikov's relief, Manilo agreed not only to sell the dead souls, but to give them away for free. He even insisted that such a gesture was proof of friendship. Chichikov accepted with graceful thanks. Inside, he felt a quiet thrill. The first piece of his plan had fallen perfectly into place. As Chichikov prepared to leave, Manilov walked him to the carriage with endless sweet words and promises of future visits. He spoke of brotherhood and lifelong loyalty. Chichikov nodded warmly, hiding his impatience. He had no time for empty speeches. His mind was already on the next estate. The road turned rough as Chichikov and Petrushka traveled onward. Clouds gathered overhead, and the countryside grew lonelier. Chichikov reviewed every step of his scheme in silence. He knew success depended not just on cleverness, but on reading each person's fears and habits. By evening, they reached the estate of Widow Korobochka. Her house was small, sturdy, and cluttered, much like its owner. Chickens wandered through the yard, dogs barked suspiciously. The place felt cautious, closed, and practical. Nothing here would come easily. Korobochka welcomed Chichikov with the worried kindness of someone always expecting trouble. She fussed over food, rooms, and blankets, but never stopped watching him. Her eyes were sharp beneath her humble manners. Chichikov immediately understood. This woman feared being cheated. That night, Chichikov listened to Korobochka complain about crops, taxes, servants, and merchants. She feared losses in every direction. She counted everything: eggs, sacks, candles, even kindness. Chichikov let her speak. He knew that people often reveal themselves most clearly when they think they are merely worrying aloud. The next morning, Chichikov carefully introduced his proposal. Korobochka frowned at once. Dead souls? Sell names? What if she was losing something valuable? What if someone else would pay more? To her, even nonsense might be worth saving if it belonged to her. Chichikov tried patience first. He explained the taxes and the burden. Korobochka still hesitated. He tried logic. She worried more. He softened his voice. She became even more uncertain. Her fear was stronger than reason. every answer only made her imagine new dangers. At last, Chichikov grew irritated. Though he hid it well, his polished manners began to crack. He raised his voice just enough to push her into agreement. Startled and confused, Korobochka finally consented. She would sell the dead souls, but only because she feared refusing might somehow be worse. Once the bargain was settled, Chichikov became charming again. He thanked her warmly, praised her hospitality, and even admired her household thrift. Korobochka relaxed a little. She still did not understand what had happened, but the papers were signed and Chichikov had what he wanted. As he rode away, Chichikov allowed himself a satisfied smile. 2 estates already, and his collection was growing. Yet he knew the greatest danger in any scheme was not failure at the start, but carelessness after success. He reminded himself to remain cautious. The road soon became chaotic. The driver lost his way among muddy tracks and dark woods. Rain fell hard, and the horses struggled through deep ruts. Chichikov, thrown from side to side in the carriage, cursed the weather and the roads in equal measure. At last, through the storm, lights appeared ahead. They had arrived at another estate, this one loud even from a distance. Dogs barked wildly, voices shouted, laughter rang out. Chichikov straightened his coat. He sensed at once that this place would bring trouble. The estate belonged to Nozdryov, a man who seemed to live in permanent excitement. He welcomed Chichikov with booming cheer, as if greeting an old friend. Nozdryov was quick to laugh, quick to boast, and quick to lie. His energy filled every room like a storm. Nozdryov talked endlessly about cards, horses, hunting dogs, feasts, and fights. He exaggerated everything. One story contradicted the next, but he spoke with such confidence that interruptions seemed pointless. Chichikov smiled politely while silently measuring the man's recklessness. The estate itself reflected its owner's nature, noisy, neglected, and full of half-finished pleasures. Fine things were broken, scattered, or poorly kept. Nozdrov loved excitement more than order. To Chichikov, that made him dangerous. A fool could be easier to manage than a man who enjoyed disorder. Still, Chichikov had come too far to hesitate. The next day, he would try again to advance his strange collection. But as he lay awake that night in Nozdroyev's house, listening to distant laughter and barking dogs, he wondered whether cleverness alone could protect him from chaos. Part 3. Chaos, Cunning, and the Weight of Greed. Morning at Nozdryov's estate began with noise. Before breakfast was finished, Nozdryov had already argued with a servant, shouted at his dogs, and changed his plans twice. Chichikov watched carefully. Men like Nozdryov were unpredictable, but they were also vain. If handled correctly, even chaos could be steered. At breakfast, Nozdryov bragged about his horses, his hunting skills, and his skill at cards. Every story grew larger as he told it. Chichikov nodded politely while choosing his moment. He knew that asking too soon would seem suspicious, but waiting too long might give Nozdryov time to invent trouble. At last, Chichikov brought up the matter of dead souls. Nozdryov burst into laughter. At first, he thought it was a joke. Then his eyes narrowed with interest. Anything strange amused him, especially if it promised gossip or advantage. He leaned closer, eager to turn the conversation into a game. Instead of agreeing to a simple sale, Nozdryov insisted on making the deal more exciting. He wanted to include a horse, a carriage wheel, a dog, and even a barrel organ in the bargain. To him, business was not about fairness. It was about winning, confusing, and entertaining himself. Chichikov refused the nonsense politely at first. He wanted only the dead souls and proper papers. Nozdryov mocked him for being dull. The room grew hotter. Chichikov felt his patience thinning. Nozdryov seemed less interested in a deal than in dragging everyone into his restless world. Soon, Nozdryov suggested settling matters over cards. Chichikov understood the trap at once. Nozdryov cheated as naturally as he breathed. His eyes sparkled with mischief, daring Chichikov to join him. But Chichikov had not built his plans by trusting men who treated life like a prank. When Chichikov refused, Nozdryov's friendliness vanished. His voice grew sharp. He accused Chichikov of arrogance and bad manners. The cheerful host became a bully in an instant. Chichikov realized that behind Nozdryov's laughter was a childish cruelty that enjoyed making others uncomfortable. The quarrel worsened. Nozdryov called for servants and spoke wildly, as if he might force Chichikov to stay. For the first time in his journey, Chichikov felt something close to fear. Cleverness was useful, but not against brute foolishness. Sometimes survival depended on leaving quickly. By good fortune, a local police captain arrived just then on unrelated business. His sudden entrance broke the tension. Nozdryov turned his attention elsewhere at once, as easily distracted as a child. Chichikov wasted no time. He bowed, excused himself, and made for the carriage. As the carriage sped away, Chichikov looked back only once. Nozdryov's estate disappeared behind trees and mud. He felt angry at the wasted effort, but also relieved. Not every door could be opened with charm. Some people were simply too wild to bargain with. His next destination was Sobakovich's estate. Even before arriving, the place felt different. The roads were straighter, the fences stronger, the buildings heavier. Everything seemed built to last. There was no decoration without purpose. Chichikov sensed he was entering the world of a practical man. Sobakevich greeted Chichikov without warmth, but without rudeness. He was large, broad-shouldered, and slow-moving, like a bear that had learned to wear a coat. His handshake was firm. His eyes were cautious. He seemed to weigh people the way merchants weigh grain. Inside the house, everything matched Sobakevich himself. Thick chairs, heavy tables, dark walls, solid meals. Even the portraits looked stern. Nothing here was dreamy, careless, or theatrical. Chichikov understood at once that charm alone would not work. Sobakevich respected substance, not flattery. At dinner, Sobakevich criticized nearly everyone in town. Officials were fools, merchants were cheats, landowners were lazy. He spoke bluntly and without apology. Chichikov listened carefully. A man who spoke harsh truths about others might also see clearly through lies. When Chichikov raised the subject of dead souls, Sobakevich did not laugh or hesitate. He understood immediately. He even seemed unsurprised that someone might find profit in names on paper. Instead of confusion, his first question was simple: how much? This time, Chichikov faced a true negotiator. Sobakevich praised each dead peasant as if speaking of living treasures. One had been a blacksmith, another a carpenter, another a hard worker worth 3 ordinary men. He talked about the dead as if their value still walked the earth. Chichikov almost admired him. Sobakevich was greedy, but honestly so. He did not pretend to be noble or sentimental. He simply wanted the best price. In a strange way, that made him easier to understand than all the others. At least his selfishness wore no mask. After much bargaining, they struck a deal. Chichikov paid more than he wanted, but he gained a large number of souls. Sobakevich signed without fuss. The business was clean, clear, and efficient. For Chichikov, it felt almost refreshing after the confusion of his earlier visits. That night, Chichikov reviewed his growing list. The names were only ink on paper, yet to him they represented something far greater: opportunity. His plan was still strange, even risky, but with every estate it was becoming more real and more dangerous. Before dawn, he prepared for one more visit: the estate of Plushkin, a man so miserly that even neighboring landowners spoke of him like a warning. Chichikov was curious. Somewhere beneath all that greed, there might still be a bargain waiting to be found. Part 4: The House of Dust and the Return to Town. The road to Plushkin's estate seemed to grow emptier with every mile. Fields lay neglected, fences sagged, and the wind carried dry leaves across the path. Even the villages nearby looked worn and tired. Chichikov felt as though he were traveling not toward a home, but toward a place forgotten by time. At last, Plushkin's estate appeared. The buildings were large but crumbling. Roofs leaned, windows were broken, and barns sagged under their own weight. Yet, signs of wealth still lingered beneath the decay. Chichikov immediately understood. This was not poverty. This was neglect turned into ruin. Servants moved through the yard like shadows, thin and silent. Their clothes were patched and faded. The dogs were too tired even to bark properly. Everything seemed drained of energy. Chichikov felt uneasy, but curiosity kept him steady. Somewhere in this lifeless place was the man who owned it all. When Plushkin finally appeared, Chichikov almost mistook him for a beggar. The old man's coat was ragged, his face pinched and sharp, and his eyes glittered with restless suspicion. Yet this scarecrow-like figure was one of the richest landowners in the district. Greed had not made him powerful, it had made him hollow. Inside the house, the air smelled of dust and stale cloth. Piles of broken objects filled corners and hallways. Cracked cups, bent tools, scraps of string, old boots. Plushkin had saved everything and used almost nothing. The rooms felt less like a home than a warehouse for fear. As Plushkin talked, Chichikov began to see the man beneath the greed. Once, perhaps, he had been capable and respected, but little by little, his fear of loss had swallowed everything: comfort, kindness, trust, even memory. He clung to useless scraps because he no longer knew how to let go. When Chichikov mentioned dead souls, Plushkin reacted with sudden, sharp interest. Unlike the others, he needed no explanation. Dead peasants still cost money, and money was the one language he never misunderstood. For the first time that day, real life entered his voice. The bargain moved quickly. Plushkin was delighted to rid himself of names that cost him taxes. He even offered Chichikov lists and records with surprising care. To Chichikov, it felt almost absurd. In this house of waste and hoarding, business had become the clearest thing of all. As Chichikov left, he looked back at the ruined estate. Plushkin's greed had not protected him from loss. It had created a prison out of abundance. For a moment, Chichikov felt an uncomfortable thought. Perhaps the hunger to possess could trap any man, even one who believed himself clever. Now, with a thick packet of purchased names, Chichikov returned toward town. His plan was finally taking shape. If everything worked, these dead souls could help him appear wealthy and respectable. On paper, he would become a man of substance. That was the power of appearances, and of a system full of holes. When Chichikov arrived back in town, he was greeted warmly. His absence had made people even more curious about him. Invitations appeared at once. The governor's circle was eager to welcome their polished visitor again. No one suspected that beneath his neat coat he carried the names of the dead. Chichikov moved carefully through the town's social life. He smiled, bowed, and attended dinners as before. But now he was more cautious. Success had brought him closer to his goal, yet also closer to danger. A careless word, a jealous glance, a curious clerk, any of these could undo everything. He began visiting offices to arrange the transfer papers. Government rooms smelled of ink, dust, and routine. Clerks stamped forms without much thought. Officials accepted signatures and seals as proof enough. Chichikov saw again how easily a confident man could move through a careless system. Still, paperwork was never simple. There were delays, missing forms, and small confusions. Chichikov stayed patient. He knew how to flatter one official, joke with another, and wait just long enough without appearing nervous. His greatest talent was not invention, it was adaptation. Meanwhile, the town's gossip began to swell. Why had Chichikov visited so many estates? Why was he so interested in records and property? Some admired his mysterious business. Others became suspicious simply because they knew nothing. In quiet towns, uncertainty grows quickly into rumor. The ladies of the town became especially fascinated. His manners, his mystery, and his sudden activity made him seem all the more important. Some imagined him wealthy, others imagined him romantic. Chichikov accepted their attention politely, though it distracted him from what mattered. At one dinner, a careless remark about estates and peasants drew more attention than Chichikov expected. He recovered smoothly, but he noticed a few sharp looks around the table. Suspicion rarely begins with facts. It begins with tone, with timing, with the sense that something does not fit. That night, alone in his room, Chichikov reviewed his progress. He had come far. The plan was bold, but the risks were multiplying. For the first time, he wondered whether success itself might become the trap. The more he gained, the more he had to protect. The next morning brought invitations, visits, and more smiles. Outwardly, Chichikov remained calm. Inwardly, he had begun measuring every conversation for danger. He had always believed he could stay one step ahead. Now, he was no longer entirely sure. As the town's curiosity deepened, Chichikov sensed that the careful balance he had built was beginning to tremble. He had gathered what he came for, but escaping with it might prove harder than collecting it. The dead were quiet. It was the living who posed the real threat. Part 5. Rumors, Revelations, and the Open Road. The town had always loved gossip, but now its whispers began to gather force. Chichikov's visits, his paperwork, and his sudden importance had become the perfect puzzle for idle minds. In drawing rooms and offices, people began fitting together details they barely understood. The less they knew, the more eagerly they guessed. Some said Chichikov was buying land. Others said he was arranging a secret government mission. A few imagined hidden treasure, political plots, or mysterious family connections. Each rumor grew as it passed from one mouth to another. Truth mattered less than the thrill of imagining it. The governor's household remained especially friendly toward Chichikov. His daughter, graceful and intelligent, had noticed his attention at past gatherings. Soon, people began wondering whether marriage might be in the air. Chichikov, who had never intended romance, suddenly found himself trapped in a story others were writing for him. At first, Chichikov tried to ignore the talk. He continued his visits, smiled at invitations, and spoke carefully. But rumors are like wind. Once they rise, no one can direct them. Even kindness began to feel dangerous. Every compliment sounded like a question hidden inside a smile. Then came Nozdryov. Loud, careless, and delighted by chaos, he arrived in town full of stories. He hinted that Chichikov was involved in something strange. Soon he was openly talking about dead souls, secret schemes, and hidden motives, mixing truth, lies, and exaggeration until no one knew what to believe. The town erupted. Some laughed at the absurdity. Others were alarmed. Officials worried about scandal. The ladies were scandalized and fascinated at once. Chichikov's name, once spoken with admiration, now carried unease. Reputation, he realized, could change faster than weather. Chichikov tried to defend himself without revealing too much. But the more carefully he spoke, the more suspicious he seemed. He had built his success on appearances, and now appearances were turning against him. The same manners that once opened doors now made people wonder what he was hiding. As questions spread, old details from Chichikov's past began to matter. People asked where he came from, how he had earned his money, and why no one knew him well. The mystery that once made him interesting now made him vulnerable. A blank past can seem elegant until someone demands answers. That night, Chichikov sat alone and thought back over his life. He had always believed that success came to those who adapted, endured, and stayed cautious. Since childhood, he had been taught to value comfort, security, and advancement above all else. He had followed that lesson faithfully. He remembered his father's advice: save money, avoid foolish risks, trust no one too easily, and rise quietly. Chichikov had obeyed. Step by step, he had learned how to flatter, bend, and endure. Yet somewhere along the way, caution had become hunger, and hunger had become a way of life. For the first time, Chichikov allowed himself to see the strange shape of his own ambition. He had chased status so long that he no longer knew what he wanted it for. The dead souls were not just a scheme. They were proof of how far he had drifted into a world of shadows and appearances. But reflection did not erase danger. By morning, the rumors had reached every corner of town. Chichikov understood that staying longer would only make things worse. Whether people truly understood his plan no longer mattered. Suspicion itself was enough to ruin him. He ordered Petrushka to prepare the carriage at once. There was no dramatic farewell, no public defense, no final speech. Chichikov had always trusted movement more than explanations. If a place became dangerous, the wisest thing was often simply to leave. As the horses were harnessed, Chichikov glanced once at the town that had welcomed him so warmly. Its streets, houses, and polite faces had seemed so easy to manage. Now they felt like a net tightening behind him. Familiar places can become traps when illusion breaks. At last, the carriage rolled out through the town gates. Chichikov sat in silence, clutching his papers. He had escaped, for now. Yet the road ahead no longer felt as simple as it once had. He had won part of his game, but not peace. The open road stretched before him again. Fields, forests, villages, and endless sky. Russia itself seemed vast and unfinished, full of beauty, waste, hope, and confusion. Chichikov looked out at the land and saw not just opportunity, but a mirror of the restless world around him. Every estate he had visited revealed something different: laziness, fear, recklessness, greed, loneliness. Yet each weakness had also reflected part of a larger human truth. Chichikov had traveled through more than countryside. He had traveled through the hidden corners of character. And what of Chichikov himself? Was he merely clever, or had he become trapped by the very system he hoped to outsmart? Gogol leaves no simple answer. Chichikov is both a trickster and a warning, a man shaped by a world where appearances often matter more than substance. As the carriage disappeared into the distance, the journey remained unfinished. The road still stretched onward, full of new schemes, new towns, and new choices. That is what makes Dead Souls endure. It is not only about one man's trick. It is about the strange roads people travel in search of meaning, security, and themselves. The end of the book.